Now for our closing keynote conversation, business lessons from the ultimate master of scale. Please welcome Reid Hoffman, co-founder, LinkedIn, and partner, Greylock, and interviewer Maneet Ahuja, senior editor, Forbes.
We are beyond thrilled to have one of the world's most successful investors and entrepreneurs joining us now. His accomplishments are too numerous to count, but some highlights. Reid Hoffman is co-founder of LinkedIn, a partner at Greylock, a founding board member of PayPal, and sits on the board of Microsoft. He's also the best-selling author of The Startup of You, Blitzscaling, and now Masters of Scale, Surprising Truths from the World's Most Successful Entrepreneurs, which is based on his award-winning podcast. Reid, thank you so much for joining us in special conversation for our inaugural Next 1000 Summit.
It's my pleasure and honor.
You've been a big supporter of our franchise since day one, and for that, we're grateful as one of our celebrity judges. You've given us great insight on picking 1,000 of the most intrepid business owners from across the country. So thank you so much for that.
Well, it's a great initiative and a great project.
Awesome, thank you. So we'd love to start out with the book, obviously, Masters of Scale, since that's an issue this audience is always constantly tackling as a founder. Tell us, what's the story behind the book?
Well, so I got into doing the podcast initially because I was doing Blitzscaling, and June Cohen, who's the former executive producer at TED, called me and said, would you like to do a podcast? And I was like, sure, why not? And then we're doing the podcast. And part of what we realized is we were actually there's so many different ways to fail at getting the scale, and that there was a kind of a limited number of very key tools and lessons for doing it. We said, well, okay, one set of things is the whole podcast, each one having a unique lesson. But how do you learn together as a team? How do you kind of like pull the themes out of the 100 podcast episodes and pull them together into abstract lessons? And that's why we thought, okay, let's go very retro and write a book.
That's awesome. And so who is the book written for? Why did you decide to write it? You've written a couple of other books before, you know, on the third go around. Why was this the topic that resonated the most?
So, part of the question was like, how do you, the people are, whether you're entrepreneurs, always getting to scale, entrepreneurs, executives, employees working at scale efforts. By the way, the scale stuff doesn't just apply to companies, like what was happening with the vaccines during COVID. That's another blitzscaling effort. There's clearly, in order to do climate change, we're going to need to be doing blitzscaling for that, for the solutions in that as well. And so, the thought was, how do we get this kind of content out there where you kind of go, okay, what are some of the really kind of surprising things that you need to do in order to get to scale and enable all of these audiences with that in a way that they can kind of, study it, iterate, collaborate together, kind of say, oh, I think Reid's wrong about this thing on page 40, which is great, right?
Yeah.
That's part of it, to always be learning.
Well, that's what I love too about it, because the path of an entrepreneur can be very lonely, right? And every situation is unique. So in some ways, you do need to crowdsource ideas in order to get amazing feedback or usable feedback. And so many people don't have access to the top VCs in the world that are looking to start businesses, especially small business owners. And so one of the things I would love to know from you is, what do you think are some things that entrepreneurs get wrong about scaling their businesses?
Well, the most frequent one is this kind of myth that you have to get your initial product market fit, and then it's just execution to scale. And it doesn't realize that all kinds of things change at each level of scale. Your go-to-market might change, your business model might change, certainly your internal organization, the way you recruit, the way you manage, the way you move from single-threaded to multi-threaded. All of these things change as you get to scale. And like, for example, one of the classic kind of things that we kind of beat the drum on and have a whole chapter on in the book is this learn to unlearn. Because you think, oh, I learned that, I'm done. And it's like, no, actually, in fact, the new game has some family resemblance to the old game, but it's a new game. And you sometimes have to unlearn earlier lessons in order to learn like how to succeed at the new level of scale.
Mm-hmm. That's such a smart point, right? Because you would think that, what took you steps 1 through 10 will take you to 10 to 20, but the foundation has changed, right? So you're not even just like you just take a prescription medicine, right? It doesn't work and you build immunity to it. So it's kind of the same concept.
Exactly. It's kind of the question. You have to constantly be evolving and changing the game, which is one of the reasons why the kind of the learning clock for executives, for employees, for founders is the most important thing on the entrepreneurial journey.
Mhm. And so what are some of the other most important takeaways from the book?
Well, we kind of try to put some of the different kind of elements together that make people go, oh, that's really interesting, and think of doing it. So like, for example, classically, when you're an entrepreneur, this is why we open the first chapter with this, which is you kind of like learn from no's, because you say, no, what you want is yes. You want everyone saying yes. And by the way, of course, that's always helpful if employees and investors and everyone else always say yes. The vast majority of cases say no. How do you learn from that? It's almost like, how do you leverage a good crisis? But how do you learn from that? How do you amplify? How do you get a higher likelihood on target? Another one is kind of like the centrality of mission to actually being able to successfully scale. Because people, like, when they go, oh yeah, this is the kind of thing this is the change in the world that we want to see, then the culture that you establish is much healthier. Everyone rows in the same direction. They're proud of it when they're talking to their friends and family later. It's like, no, this thing that we're doing is really important in the world, and this is why. And so that's why it's kind of the last chapter, the Trojan horse, which is to always have the mission be part of what you're doing. Anyway, so there's a whole stack of them, and obviously we could take days.
We could go through it over a period of weeks or days. So what's some of the advice in the book that's you think hardest to follow or most counterintuitive, right?
Well, so I think, the learn unlearn is usually like is definitely, because you got to go, oh, well, I learned it, so I know what to do. And you're like, no, you actually have to learn new things, and they will change some of the old ones. I think also, kind of like part of the reason why we opened the very first Master to Scale podcast, the very first one was Brian Chesky, was that they're kind of like, oh, only do things at scale. And it's like, well, actually, in fact, if you do that, you'll frequently not figure out some really critical things that you'll later figure out how to scale. So the Brian Chesky principle of 11-star design, where you kind of figure out, okay, I can't do that, but I can do this 7-star thing, and I can do it this way that will really scale. And so doing those handcrafted things that won't scale, to experiment and learn on the path to figure out what is most critical to scale. That's a frequent counterintuitive lesson that the engineering or the systems mindset doesn't get.
And is that it sounds like that's earlier to do at the onset rather than as you're further along, right? Because the train is already moving forward. It's out of the station. In some ways, at the beginning, you don't know what's going to work, what's not going to work, right?
Yes, exactly. And but it goes along, because, like, for example, you say, well, we've now got this thing scaling, but maybe this new feature or this new product extension or something else, and you might go back to doing handcrafted then. Even when you're a company of 400 people, you're doubling your employee base and you're doing this. So it isn't only the first thing. It's kind of multiple learning moments along the journey of the company.
And so now that the book is out, and I've had this from my own personal experience, and you've been getting feedback, have you realized that there's anything you're like, oh man, I wish I added X, or I wish I added Y, or I clarified this or that? Have you had that experience?
Well, I always have that experience, because you're always trying to learn. I'd say my experience was probably, and maybe what we're doing today is part of the learning from this, is that not only to do audio and not only to do written, but also do video. Like, I think I should have done some more video kind of lessons around the book, maybe, kind of getting some kind of cameos, because some people learn by reading, some people learn by listening, some people learn by watching and listening to a lecture. And I'd say, like, some access there is one of the things that I've been most recently thinking about.
So is that a little bit of a clue as to a new project that might be forthcoming, or am I reading into that?
Well, if time were infinite, certainly, right? The prioritization is one of the key things. We definitely will do, I think, a follow-on book at some point in the next few years, because we had a lot of different themes that we thought were important. When you kind of collapse to 10, you're kind of like, well, the 11th and the 12th was really hard. And as we get new interviews with a broader scope of folks, not just within the, kind of iconic large tech companies, but a broader range of scale entrepreneurship, that adds in new lessons as well. As you move from software to hardware, from, bits to atoms. So
Yeah.
we will have more.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, it might be interesting for the companies just under that unicorn status that are looking to break through, right?
Yes.
But you know better than most, isn't you've seen them all, so you probably have a running list already. But if there's one conversation from Masters of Scale that you think every entrepreneur should listen to, I've heard you refer to the Brian Chesky interview a lot, but which one would it be and why?
Well, let me give two. So one of them, I think, was kind of on a personal surprise note, was Tyra Banks. And I think that one would thought that she went into becoming a supermodel and everything else just by being like absolutely gorgeous and everything else. And actually, she approached the whole thing with an entrepreneurial mindset. And part of what we're trying to do with Masters of Scale and with the book and everything else is show that the entrepreneurial mindset can work everywhere. And that gave an example, like how she approached her modeling career, and it's replete with how she then starts doing entrepreneurship afterwards, and doing A/B testing, experimenting, and market work, and all the rest. So I think Tyra's kind of work and contribution kind of is stunning and good. And then I think also I mean, basically, all of these are great. I think that when we like, for example, like Barry Diller's Learn Unlearn. We had a couple of different ones on culture with Anil Busri and Reid Hastings. Like, I think there's a stack of them. And like one of the classic pieces of advice I give an entrepreneur is raise more money than you think that you need. And like Miriam Nafisi very early on was kind of key on this as well. So I think that's that gives some scope, but obviously we're very selective in who we actually go do interviews with. So we're proud of all of our children.
Yeah, no, and I'm sure you get this question a lot. One person that I'm curious that you learned from is Elon Musk, who I know that you have a long relationship with from your days working at PayPal. What are some of the lessons that you learned from speaking to him? And also another one of our next 1,000 judges, Melody Hobson. Would love to hear some of those takeaways.
So Elon, the principal thing, actually, when you look at where Elon has been just like 100 out of 10 successful and pulling off magic tricks, is going against bad competition, right? So the auto industry, basically buried electric cars because they wanted to just keep their franchise going. And so, kind of getting out of the pack, doing electric cars, moving from a mechanical engineering paradigm to a software paradigm, an electric paradigm, was one of the things that, kind of stunning. Obviously, similar things around rockets and having these companies that had spent decades doing no R&D. And then with Melody, there's a whole stack of things. I mean, we kind of, Melody has such deep expertise and a learning approach to boards, and boards are so important. So there's a whole bunch of things about how to onboard board members and how to have the right kind of set of board perspectives in order to have the right kind of governance. And then, of course, Melody's iconic thing is, don't think about diversity as something you want as blindness, like, oh, we don't see race, oh, we don't see gender, but to bring it in a way that makes you higher performance. And Melody has a set of great points on that. Some of it we captured on the podcast, some of which obviously in our iconic TED Talk. But those would be just two of these the many mentors that I have as I learn.
Awesome. And so one of the questions that I get a lot when I'm speaking to founders who are like, okay, well, I can't get in front of the Greylocks or the Sequoias or the other big VCs. What do they tell you? Well, how do they determine which ideas are worth investing in? How do I get on their radar as a business? Are there certain criteria that you have to meet?
Well, so, I mean, look, the classic course is a massive market, a new, unique plan shot on it, technological shift in plan, and then the right kind of entrepreneurial skills and team to potentially pull off these heroic journeys. And one of the challenges, of course, when dealing with VCs is, your average general partner at a top tier firm will look at 800 deals a year and say yes to up to 2 of them, right?
Mhm.
So it's kind of this challenge. And then, by the way, C, have thousands come in. So the usual thing is that, like, why is, like, at least the area that I look at is, why is the thing that you're thinking about contrarian but potentially right, right? So,
Mhm.
like, people, it's like it's not quite in the beaten path. Like,
Mhm.
your inbox gets full of, it's AI but for board games, right? You're like,
Mhm.
well, okay, like, everyone in the world is AI these days. So what's your unique thing that's really
Mhm.
interesting at scale that other people think, well, maybe that's not a good idea, but if it turns out to be a good idea, might be an amazing idea, right? Which is one of the things that attracted me to Airbnb in the beginning.
Mhm. Have you noticed that it evokes a specific feeling, or is it exclusively also based on a company's ability to scale and, overall market opportunity?
Well, you have to have a theory by which it can be huge. It's simply not worth there. Like, again, in that kind of saying yes to up to 2 out of 800, you have to have, like, it could be huge. Sometimes it's because, oh, this person has this really unique access and has this amazing talent, and we'll do, as because
Mhm.
Greylock, we do a lot of very seed investing, and so that frequently is, there's a vision, an envelope, like a napkin, and like 3 people with an idea, and then how do you build it? But sometimes it's like, there's a technological change, that technological change is going to transform one or more industries, and you're at the leading edge of that technological change. You have a unique ability to understand how that's going to affect an industry. Again, Airbnb is an example, but there's many examples of that. Similarly, Zynga or LinkedIn or others, PayPal,
Mhm.
and so those are the kinds of things that you would kind of look at. And frequently, the thing is, be very ambitious, but don't be ambitious in a way that this will be huge. You're like, no, why will it be huge? What's the theory of the game? What's the insight that you have that would
Mhm.
lead this to being huge that many other smart people wouldn't have?
Mhm. So I want to shift a little bit because I know we're almost out of time. To you personally, right? Because sitting right in front of this audience here, like I mentioned at the intro, you yourself are one of the most successful entrepreneurs and investors of all time. But do you have any major regrets as an investor? Either a company that you bet on that you shouldn't have, or a company that you had the opportunity to invest in but didn't?
Well, actually, the ones that you invested in that failed are not the really big ones. The really big misses are the ones that are huge that you didn't bet on.
Mhm.
And I obviously, like many smart, self-reflective people, have a large list of those. Maybe the right one to mention is Pinterest, because
Mhm.
the angel round came into my office at LinkedIn, the Series A came into my office, and I just didn't understand how it was a new medium for communication and discovery and so forth. I thought, oh, it was a feature, not a platform, not a medium. And despite really liking, Ben and Paul, it was like, nah, I don't get it. And yeah, well, I didn't get it. It was awesome.
Any other ones that you walked away from that maybe you thought back on that you should have invested in?
Oh, I'm sure there's others. Let's see. So, um, you know, like, um, like, I wasn't wrong to not do odd blog, which was audio blogging,
Mhm.
even though we later kind of obviously have podcasting and so forth. But when it shifted to Twitter, I didn't get it. And by the time I got it, it was when it was already, large and huge, because the question of how do you have a kind of a global communications
Mhm.
scheme around all this. I mean, I'm pretty sure if I went back and looked at it, I was like, oh yeah, that one. Stripe, the Collisons and the vision.
Yeah.
Because of my experience with PayPal, I was like, well, no, this is brutally hard. And yes, it is brutally hard, but they are also amazingly good. So it just kind of you know any reflective investor,
Mhm.
this list will actually go on and on
Yeah,
someday.
yeah, yeah. Well, it's interesting. It's like the muscle memory works to your advantage, but sometimes, like we said, the foundation is always different. It's a different time period. There are different players in the marketplace. Sometimes that's not the case, right? So,
Yes.
I mean, all you can do is make your best move, and you've made many, many, many. So I know, we only have time for one last question. You founded your first company, SocialNet, an online dating website on matching people with similar interests, all the way back in 1997. I know because I actually knew about this story before because I was working on a book proposal, and I had looked into all of the work that you had done on it. It was called An Idea Before Its Time. What inspired you to start your very first business, and what did you learn from that experience?
And a week later, he finishes answering the question. So what inspired me was this notion that our real life together with the internet, amplifying our real life, is the thing that most matters. Obviously, this goes on in the various things that I've done, from LinkedIn to PayPal, Airbnb, etc. And then the principal thought was, look, there's a set of things. Dating is one, roommates, activity partners, golf, tennis, etc. How do you find the right person to kind of share this experience with? And I had this whole idea, which I think is still a very good one, about how to do profiling and all the rest. And then all the learnings were, well, don't invent the product without inventing the go-to-market. My whole thing about be embarrassed by your first product release, as an emphasis on speed, is the kind of thing that is so kind of important to and speed of execution and speed of learning from your customers is so important for these journeys to scale and so forth. And it just kind of went on and on. I mean, during SocialNet, literally every Friday, and it wasn't like, oh, so-and-so returning your phone call or not. There were things about how to play the game that I wish I had known on Monday. Like that's the nature of the learning curve.
All right, Reid. Well, thank you so much. I think we're out of time. I wish we had an hour or 2 hours, or could do our own podcast, because I have a whole laundry list of other questions that I wish I had the opportunity to ask, but I think we will leave it there. Thanks again for being a judge since day one on Next 1000, and we look forward to doing more together.
Likewise. And, this conversation will continue. It's awesome.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Now for closing remarks, please welcome Maneet Ahuja, Senior Editor, Forbes.
Well, what an incredible event. We've heard from some of the most successful business leaders, investors, and entrepreneurs in the world this afternoon, as well as many of our Next 1000 All-Stars. A big thank you to you all for joining us as we celebrated our inaugural Next 1000 franchise and all the tremendous success of small business owners across the country. And a special thank you to our sponsor, Square. I hope you all are leaving reinvigorated and inspired to make your business dreams a reality. Have a great afternoon.
That concludes the Forbes Next